Most people don't think they would ever trade something permanent for something temporary. It sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Not your time, not your identity, not your future, and definitely not your soul. Because when something is framed that way, it feels extreme. It feels like something only a desperate person would do. But the story of Faust doesn't begin with someone desperate. It begins with someone who has already done everything the right way. Someone who has knowledge, status, and understanding, and still feels like something is missing. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because it doesn't ask what someone with nothing would do. It asks what someone who already has everything would still be willing to give up. Because that gap, that feeling that something hasn't settled yet, doesn't go away just because you've achieved something. Sometimes it becomes more noticeable. And once that feeling is there, it starts to shape the way you look at everything else. It makes you question whether what you have is enough or just close to it. Faust is not a failure. That's important. He's not someone who couldn't figure things out. He's a scholar, someone who has spent his life learning, studying, building an understanding of the world that most people never reach. And from the outside, that should be the end of the story. That should be the point where things settle. But it doesn't work that way. Because knowledge doesn't always give you what you think it will. It doesn't always create clarity. It doesn't always create peace. Sometimes it does the opposite. It shows you how much there is that you still don't understand. It shows you the limits of what you can actually reach. And that's where Faust finds himself. Not lacking knowledge, but running into its boundaries. And that's a different kind of frustration. Because it's not about failing. It's about realizing that even success has limits. And that's where things begin to shift. Because at some point, effort stops feeling like progress. It starts to feel like repetition. Like you're moving but not actually getting anywhere new. And that creates a different kind of tension. Not the tension of trying harder, but the tension of wondering if trying harder will even work. And that's what Faust is dealing with. The realization that everything he's done so far hasn't brought him to the place he expected it to. And that's where the dangerous thought starts to form. Not that he's done something wrong, but that the process itself might not be enough. That maybe there's something beyond effort, something beyond patience, something that can get him there faster. And once that idea takes hold, it changes everything. Because now it's not about continuing. It's about finding a way around the limits he's been running into. That realization that effort might not be enough is where things start to get dangerous. Because once you believe that, you stop looking for answers inside the process and start looking for something outside of it. Something faster, something more direct. And that doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like adapting. Like recognizing that the path you're on has limits and deciding to move beyond them. But that shift changes the way you think about everything else. Because now it's not about building something over time. It's about finding a way to skip ahead. And skipping ahead always comes with a cost. Not always an obvious one, not always something you feel immediately, but something that gets traded whether you realize it or not. And once you accept that trade as an option, it becomes harder to go back to the slower path. Because the slower path starts to feel unnecessary. That's when Mephistopheles enters the story. Not as something overwhelming or chaotic, but as something precise. Something that understands exactly what Faust is missing. He doesn't offer destruction. He doesn't offer anything that looks obviously dangerous. He offers a solution. A way to bypass the limits Faust has been running into. A way to experience everything he feels like he's been kept from. And that's what makes the offer work. Because it doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like clarity. Like someone finally explaining why things haven't been working the way they should. And once something feels like an answer, it becomes a lot easier to accept it. Because you're not thinking about the cost yet. You're thinking about the resolution. The deal itself is simple. Faust gets what he wants: knowledge, experience, fulfillment. Everything he feels like he's been chasing but hasn't been able to reach. And in return, he gives up his soul. Not immediately, not in a way that feels real in the moment, but eventually. And that's what makes it easy to accept. Because the cost doesn't feel immediate. It doesn't feel connected to what he's gaining right now. It feels distant, abstract. Something that exists later, not something that affects the present. And that's usually how these decisions happen. Not as something obvious, but as something that feels disconnected from the outcome. Because if the cost isn't immediate, it's easy to ignore it. Easy to believe that it won't matter until it's already too late. At first, it works. Faust gets what he wanted. Access to things he couldn't reach before. Experiences that feel new, intense, meaningful. And for a while, it feels like confirmation. Like he made the right choice. Like he finally found the thing that was missing. Because everything feels more immediate, more real, more complete. And that's what makes it convincing. Because when something works at first, it's hard to question it. It's hard to step back and ask whether there's something built into it that you're not seeing yet. If you like looking at these stories a little differently, you can subscribe. That moment, where everything feels like it's finally working, is usually where people stop asking questions. Because success, especially immediate success, has a way of closing off doubt. It makes you believe that the direction you're moving in is the right one. And once you believe that, it becomes harder to see anything that doesn't fit that idea. But over time, something starts to shift. Not all at once, not in a way that's obvious, but gradually. Because the experiences don't last. The satisfaction doesn't stay. What once felt intense starts to feel normal. What once felt meaningful starts to feel expected. And that creates a pattern. The need for more intensity, more experience, more of whatever created that feeling in the first place. And that's where the trade becomes clear. Because it's not just about what Faust gave up at the end. It's about what he gives up along the way. The ability to feel satisfied with anything that doesn't escalate. That's where the pattern really takes hold. Because it doesn't feel like losing control. It feels like maintaining momentum. Like continuing something that's already working. But what's happening is more subtle than that. The baseline keeps shifting. What once felt like enough becomes the starting point for the next step. And that step has to be bigger, more intense, more meaningful. Because the previous version doesn't hit the same way anymore. And that creates a loop that doesn't resolve. Because the thing you're chasing isn't static. It moves with you. It adjusts to whatever level you reach. And that means there's no point where it settles, no point where it stops asking for more. And the longer you stay in that loop, the harder it becomes to recognize that it's happening at all. Because it just feels like continuing forward. And eventually that catches up to him. Because there's a point where the pattern stops working, where more doesn't create anything new, where the thing he traded for starts to feel just as empty as what he had before. And that's where the realization begins. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow understanding that something hasn't actually been solved. That the thing he thought would complete everything has just changed the way the problem shows up. And that's what makes it difficult to accept, because it means the issue wasn't the path. It was the expectation. And once you realize that there's no easy way to go back to the version of yourself that believed something external could fix it, that's what makes Faust different from other stories. It's not about being tricked. It's not about being forced into something. It's about choosing something that feels right in the moment without fully understanding what it requires. Because the question isn't whether the deal works. It does. The question is what it takes from you in the process. What you give up, not at the end, but along the way. And whether the thing you're getting is worth that trade. Because some things don't feel like losses until you no longer have them. And this is where the story becomes less about Faust and more about something people recognize in themselves. Because it doesn't have to look like a deal with a demon to follow the same pattern. It can be something smaller, something that feels completely normal, chasing something that feels like it will finally make things settle. More progress, more money, more control, more of whatever feels like it moves you closer to that point where everything feels complete. And it works for a while. That's the part that makes it convincing. Because you see the results, you feel the movement, you start to believe you're getting closer. And that belief makes it harder to question what it's costing you along the way. The time, the energy, the parts of your life that don't fit into that pursuit anymore. And that shift doesn't feel dramatic when it's happening. It feels like focus, like discipline, like doing what you're supposed to be doing. But over time, it starts to narrow everything else, until you realize that the thing you were chasing wasn't actually leading to a finish point. It was just creating another version of the same pursuit. And that's where the question changes. It's not about whether it works. It's about whether it ever ends. And once you ask that, you start to see the trade more clearly.